One of the more notable differences between this presidential transition and the one that occurred 8 years ago in 2017 is the relative lack of a Democratic resistance to Trump. So, if you recall back 8 years ago, there was the Women's March, there were a number of other massive protests. While Democrats in government talked about ways to resist Trump, to Trump proof the government, and do all sorts of other things, there's far less talk about such things this year. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
Hey, and I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what's going on in U.S. politics. We also care deeply about pastries. This is our first episode of our second season. So last year, we were focusing on the 2024 presidential election and a lot of the issues surrounding it. We're going to pivot a bit for 2025. Our specialties, of course, are still parties and campaign. We're not about to claim to be experts in things we don't know anything about. And we're not going to do a show about every outrage and every norm violation to come out of the Trump administration, and there will be plenty of those. Rather, we're going to try and dig into key issues as they unfold this year, seeking to understand how the party's strategies are shifting, how Democrats and Republicans are governing this year and preparing for the campaigns of 2026 and 2028, what we know about the current political environment and the shape of democracy now that we didn't know a few years ago, and more. We're seeking a more regular publishing schedule of once a week, and we're grateful for you joining us. We also encourage you to follow us and rate our podcast if you like it. Be sure to tell your friends about it. We would like to grow it this year. For our first episode of 2025, we are recording this on January 14th, 6 days before Donald Trump assumes the presidency for the second time. One of the more notable differences between this presidential transition and the one that occurred 8 years ago in 2017 is the relative lack of a Democratic resistance to Trump. So if you recall back 8 years ago, there was the Women's March, there were a number of other massive protests. While Democrats in government talked about ways to resist Trump, to Trump proof the government, and do all sorts of other things, there's far less talk about such things this year. With Democrats largely seeming pretty dispirited and aimless, and Trump's team far more organized about staffing up the White House and figuring out what their agenda is. John, I want to start off by pitching off to you. What do you think best accounts for the differences between this year and what happened in 2017? What are Democrats trying to do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think this is a great topic for us to start our second season on because as you said, we're trying to do something a little bit different with this podcast, and I think the main thing that our goal here is to try to explain what's going on to each other, but also hopefully to the listeners. And I will start off by saying I don't fully yet think that I understand what's going on, and there's a lot I'd love to get your insight on from the political science perspective. I think. I speak for a lot of Democrats when I say I don't really know what's happening right now. It's a remarkably different moment than it was. I think the biggest foundational reason for this is simply the election results. That the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton had a substantial national vote majority. She won. Um, you know, she lost the electoral vote by a few thousand votes in a few key states. In a very real sense, Democrats felt like an election that we should have won was taken away from us. That through the quirks of the American system, the guy who came in second got to be in charge. There was a ton of outrage just built into that sense of like we had gotten more votes, a lot more votes, and we should be running the government. The fact that Trump won the electoral college by a substantial margin, but also won the popular vote, I think has changed the emotional content of Democrats from the highest elected positions all the way down to the rank and file voters. That there's a really different sense that, we weren't tricked, we weren't cheated, we just lost. And we lost, it. Trump massively overstates the size of his election win. I think a lot of people who went to bed at 11 p.m. on election night, thought that this was something approaching a landslide. It wasn't. And as more voters come in and as the votes were all counted, this was a close election that Republicans won narrowly, but they did win it. And I think that has really impacted the emotional content of where folks are going. From a strategic perspective, I think that Democrats are completely leaderless right now. There is nobody who the average Democratic voter would point to as the leader of the party. Hakeem Jeffries, I think, is doing a really good job being the leader of Democrats in the House, but most Democratic voters don't know his name. Obviously every Democratic congressperson does. Chuck Schumer has been leading the Democrats in the Senate for a long time, but the Senate um, is a has a lot of members who don't necessarily look to be led. There's a lot of sort of independent power sources there. We have some popular Democratic governors in a few states, but there isn't a person who is setting the agenda here in the way that after the 2016 election, I think Hillary Clinton had a lot of sway over the party, but Nancy Pelosi really was a very powerful force that a lot of Democratic voters understood and rallied around. And I think the way that she was setting the pace, you know, had a different content for what Democrats were doing. But yeah, I think that the biggest thing that we need to figure out is, given that the majority of Americans wanted this guy to be in office, what is the best reaction to that? And I think as we're recording right now, the Pete Hegseth confirmation hearing is happening. I think that'll give some interesting early clues, right? Like, does he get any Democratic votes in the Senate? Does John Fetterman, do some of the more conservative Democratic senators say, hey, one of the norms of democracy is the president gets the team that he wants. And if this is who he wants, then we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Or do we see a full party line resistance? Do we get, are there a couple of Republican senators who are willing to stand up to Trump on Hegseth? Does Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski or any of these folks say, we're not going this far? After Matt Gaetz was nominated to be Attorney General, there was resistance among Republicans. I think it's easy for people on the internet to say like, oh, every single Republican will always give him what he wants. I don't think that's what's happening. It isn't what happened with the Gates nomination. But where they draw the line, if Matt Gaetz is unacceptable, is Pete Hegseth acceptable? Where does that happen? I think that'll be an interesting early set of clues. But I think more broadly, and I want to get your thoughts on this from a political science perspective, but there's definitely some Democrats who are saying this guy's the president. We should try to get the best outcomes that we can. There are other Democrats who are saying this guy's the president. We need to dig our heels in and resist everything to the greatest of our ability. I'm really not sure where we're going to land.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I agree with you that the party is quite leaderless right now. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean, just
No,
literally, it's
it's
leaderless.
leaderless.
And I agree with how you described the election. I mean, 2016 was a very flukish election. It was an outcome a lot of people didn't think possible. Whereas 2024, Democrats knew a Trump victory was possible. They made the case, with a competent candidate who very clearly laid out the problems with Donald Trump. And, plurality voted for Trump anyway. And I think just Democrats just don't really know what to do with that information. That this is just simply the outcome that the country wanted.
It's the outcome that we
Yeah,
wanted, and
yeah,
it's in a lot of ways the Democratic Party has gone from Obama to Clinton pretty seamlessly, although, the Bernie Sanders primary campaign did, as much as they could. But at no point was Bernie Sanders likely to win the nomination. That was always pretty clear. And then it went from, Clinton to Biden relatively seamlessly, like he had been Obama's running mate. The primary was a little bit more engaged, but once COVID hit and, people kind of got serious about it, Biden won almost every state in the Democratic primary. That there has been, and then obviously Biden to Harris was a pretty clean handoff transition. So it's been a long time since Democrats really went through a process of figuring out who we wanted to be in charge. And what the 2024 election felt like was, the country saying to this long string of Democratic leaders, like, we're not interested in what you're selling. We don't want it anymore. Which is an important lesson for us to hear. We've got to respond to that. But it means that they're, to the degree that, Harris, I don't think is looked at right now as the leader of the Democratic Party. She may run in the primary in 2028, she might do well. I don't know. But right now, no one is looking to her to say, tell us what to do. In part because it feels like this long string of folks, the people have said, we don't want any more of this. We're done here. Which means that we're going to have to really do a detailed, complex process to figure out who our leaders are. And I think, you know, you and I will have plenty to talk about over the next couple of years as we analyze and interpret that race, which has obviously already started in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's gonna be a really interesting time.
Well, one of the things, I mean, a lot of people have criticized the Democratic Party for having leadership that is far too old with Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, and that has changed.
And Chuck Schumer.
Um, and Chuck Schumer. And so, Hakeem Jeffries is in charge of Democrats in the House. You're right that a lot of Americans still don't know who he is, but, he's going to become a more visible figure over the next couple of years. And we have a very open Democratic presidential nomination going forward. But whoever is the nominee is definitely going to be younger than Joe Biden. I feel very confident in that. But
You don't think it's going to be Bernie 2028?
Well, you never know. I'm still pretty sure no, but maybe he'll run anyway. Why not? With one of the things that's going to be interesting over the next couple of weeks is there's going to be confirmation hearings, as you pointed out. This is an opportunity from some Democrats to make a little name for themselves, to get some attention for themselves. They can be very critical of some of these nominees. There's lots of material to be critical of Hegseth and others. And so this is a chance for some Democratic senators to, emerge in the spotlight a little bit. But I think just generally what we're seeing is, Democrats, this is a critique by Jamel Bouie in the New York Times over the last couple of weeks, that the Democrats are not yet acting like an opposition party. They're the minority, but they're not yet, they haven't come up with a coherent opposition strategy yet. And that may emerge. It has not emerged yet. And it is a good question, just in the poli-sci literature. What is the best strategy for an opposition party? And it's honestly, the evidence is kind of a mixed bag.
What? Poli-sci? Is it definitive?
Yeah,
I can't believe it.
But you can think of it in terms of members of Congress, senators who are Democrats from competitive states and districts. What's in their best interest? Should they stand with their party in opposing everything Trump does? Or should they be trying to eke out what they can from the Republican majority and maybe still, claim some wins for their district or for their state? And I'd say, lots of different people will approach this in different ways. I don't know there's any sort of one definitive thing to do. I think we had examples from early in Obama's term, when Democrats had a fairly large House majority at that point. But they knew the party was looking fairly unpopular going into the 2010 midterms. And a lot of Democrats were not sure about whether they should be supporting, say, healthcare reform, the Affordable Care Act, which was looking unpopular. And Pelosi,
I'm struggling because I was the targeting director at the DCCC in that cycle.
Oh, there you go. Okay,
I was deeply involved in a lot of those. Yep.
Yeah, and Pelosi made a point of saying, look, we need this to win, but we don't need everyone to vote for it. And if you're worried about your district, you're free to vote against it. And I was part of a paper that found there was actually some evidence here that if you voted for healthcare reform, it cost you votes, and that may have been enough to cost Democrats their majority that year. If you voted for TARP and some of the other contriversial things that year, that may have cost you votes as well. So that that's something for Democrats to think about.
Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal was voted that year, and 15 Democratic House members voted against it.
Yeah.
And it passed, but that was not an insubstantial walk. But again, those were folks that the leadership knew how many votes they could lose.
Yeah, there's also an interesting case if you think about Joe Lieberman. Okay, he was famously moderate Democratic senator, thorn in the Democrat side, and he was sort of confronting what to do in the first George Bush administration in the early 2000s. And he made the choice to side with Bush in a number of things very publicly, on the Iraq War, on a few other things. And that may have, he probably saw that as helping him, but it cost him a lot in the 2006 election cycle when he was running for re-election. It actually cost him his own party's nomination. He faced a lot of organized opposition from more liberal Democrats in the primary. And so that is a situation that some Democrats could face if they work too much with Trump. And I think, Trump is even a more divisive figure than George W. Bush was. And if you were alive back then, Bush was a pretty divisive figure. So there's some evidence there. I also wanted to give a shout out to Matt Green, who's a political scientist at Catholic University in DC. He put out a book a few years ago called Underdog Politics, which made the very good case that, if you're in the House minority, that does not mean you're completely powerless. House minority members have used obstruction, have used sort of public demonstration and protests, have used press conferences and other things to actually slow down the majority party, to change what the majority party was capable of, to occasionally thwart the majority. And that they have some powers there. I'll post a link to this book in our on
Yeah.
our website.
Well, and I think that the margin in the House is going to mean that is more true than it ever has been, right? That, especially right now with a couple vacant seats, as Elise Stefanik and Michael Waltz get confirmed, the working majority, and I'm doing a turn on my bread there right now, so I apologize if I'm looking down. We
You're
are
working on
power and
bread right now?
flour.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
I'm doing the flour part of the power and flour while I talk. Um, the the functional Republican majority is just going to be a couple seats, and I do think that a united Democratic opposition can do a lot because there are so many nihilistic Republicans who just enjoy watching things burn. That if the Democrats stay united and one or two Republicans goes a little bit nuts, a lot of things can be brought down. But I do think that question of Democratic unity is an open one. One of the, I think, unique features of the last maybe 10 years in American public life is how united, particularly the House Democratic Caucus, has been. And some of that was Nancy Pelosi's very strong leadership. Some of that is changes in the way that campaigns are funded and structured, right? That we're in a world now where, DC funders, the DCCC, the House Majority PAC, the sort of the powers that the Democratic establishment has a lot of control over how competitive House races are funded, which has given, I think, the leadership more control over their members. When you look at, I don't know if I don't know how closely people are remembering. It feels like a lifetime ago, but when the House Republican leadership chaos that led to Mike Johnson, with those sort of 17 votes for Speaker, not a single Democrat defected on any of those votes, which is incredible. The unity there has been really incredible over the years. I don't know if that's going to continue for lots of different reasons, right? If you are a Democratic member in the Rio Grande Valley, if you're Henry Cuellar, who's in Laredo voted pretty strongly for Trump, what incentive do you have to listen to what some guy from Brooklyn is telling you makes sense for his politics, right? There are a lot more Democratic members sitting in Trump seats than there used to be, some of whom are in Trump seats that we wouldn't have expected to have been Trump seats before the election, right? There's a couple seats in New Jersey that have I didn't even know the names and numbers of that Trump carried. And there's now members there who have a very different set of incentives than the leadership might. And I think will be a really interesting test to see again in a couple years. One thing that I always come back to when I think about these kinds of questions is that Democrats and Republicans have really different incentives when it comes to opposition and obstruction. That Republicans felt no compunction in trying to burn everything down when Biden was president, when Obama was president. That they Mitch McConnell famously said, as Obama was being sworn in, that the only goal of the Republican Party was to make him one-term president. And it's easy for Democrats to get bad about that when they see Democrats behaving differently. But what Republican voters want Republicans to do is to burn things down, right? Like you've got a party that exists that tells their voters that government doesn't work, and then they go about proving it as soon as they get into office. And the incentives are different. Democratic voters want Democratic politicians to make the government work. And when I'm talking about Democratic voters, I'm talking about the actual Democratic voters, not the loudest voices on social media. Because a lot of voices on social media who are Democrats want Democrats to blow up the government and burn everything down. But if you ask a core primary voting, you know, older women, older African American voters, middle class voters, working class voters, if you ask them how they want Democrats to proceed right now, you would see a lot of them saying that they want Democrats to make the government work the best way that they can. In part, that's because fundamentally people vote for Democrats because they believe that the government is important and they want to see it function. So I do think that, like, John Fetterman is going to Mar-a-Lago to meet with President Trump. He is doing a lot of things that are going to annoy some of the loudest voices in the party, but probably speak pretty strongly to Democratic voters in Pennsylvania. And I think that we're going to see a lot of different incentives where, if your primary audience are activists and donors, you're going to behave very differently than if your primary audience are voters. And I do think it's going to be important for folks who are commenting on what's going on, who live in coastal cities, who live in safe districts, to make sure that they're doing some real stopping and checking to see if what they're advocating for actually is what the base of our party wants or not.
Hmm. I have a question for you about basically what are the lessons for Democrats from Trump's first term? I mean, my read on things is that Democrats were fairly unified in resisting him and opposing his presidency. And in what they got for that is in 2018 they had a very good midterm. They took control of the House. They won the 2020 presidential election. I mean, it seemed like that sort of resistance was benefited their party. And I'm curious if now maybe they didn't win as many seats as they wanted. There were some complaints about that, but it didn't seem like whatever the strategy is now, if it's accommodation for some, that was the read on what to do after his first term. But I might be misreading that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's correct. I think that most Democrats would say that the 2018 and 2020 experience was positive, that resistance was fairly effective. I have a bit of a hot take here, that I'm workshopping. So, we'll put this out in the world, but I don't necessarily know that I agree with what I'm about to say, but I want to lay out a theory. I think one of the challenges the Democrats faced in 2024 was that because we had been very successful in opposition, in the first Trump administration, that we had sanded off a lot of the roughest edges of what was about to happen. That Obamacare was not overturned, that there was not a mass deportation effort, there was not a huge border wall, Social Security wasn't privatized, all sorts of things that Trump and or the Republican majority had said that they wanted to do didn't happen. Um, in part because the opposition was pretty effective. What that meant was that a lot of the attacks that Harris made in 2024 didn't resonate with voters, right? That she would say Donald Trump wants to do X, Y, and Z, which she was absolutely right. Donald Trump does want to do the things that she was saying. And voters say, well, he was president and he didn't do any of that, right? Like, you say that he wants to deport 30 million people, but he was president and he didn't deport 30 million people. And it gave people a permission structure for voting for Trump because they just didn't think that he could do the things he said he wanted to do. Um, and I think that you could tell a story of opposition to Trump was successful enough that it made the price of voting for a Republican zero, right? That particularly in a place like Arizona, where at the same time Democrats are running ads about abortion and how Trump wanted to ban abortion, there was a state ballot initiative that allowed voters to protect abortion rights. It was really easy to say, it's not going to cost me anything to express my anger by voting Republican because nothing's going to happen, right? The American government is so sclerotic, things are so broken, no one gets anything done, everything gets filibustered, everything falls apart. It doesn't matter who's in charge, so I can vote emotionally. I can vote for somebody who's going to make me feel good, and reflect the anger that I'm feeling back at me because the consequences are so minimal. And I think there's a story you could tell where the best thing for the long term health of the uh, American democracy is to let some of the terrible, in my opinion, and I think a lot of Democratic voters' opinion, terrible things that the Republicans want to do, to let them do it. and to let voters see that this is what happens when you put these people in charge, right? That, if you like Social Security and Medicare, well, guess what? They're coming for it. And they are going to gut it. And if your mom relies on Medicaid, it's going to get cut. And if you don't want that, you have to stop putting these people in charge. Obviously, there's huge downsides to that. The biggest one being that the people who are going to suffer the most are not the people who made these decisions. But yeah, I know, and this gets into the political science literature and much more your area of expertise. American politics has so many more veto points than any other political system in the world, right? That we have so many ways that things can be stopped that it makes it very hard to accomplish much. And it means that a lot of politics is about noise. It's about, and to use the pro wrestling term, it's kayfabe, right? Like no one's actually going to do anything. So all we're doing is screaming at each other, and everybody knows at the end of the day that it's all for nothing. Actually making American politics be about something might be what needs to happen to break the fever, and to get people to stop voting against their interests. Now, that's an incredibly risky strategy. A lot of people would suffer from that. This is not me advocating for it, but I do think that you look at the differences between the first Trump administration and the second are going to be really stark. In the first Trump administration, there were a lot of sort of normal Republicans, a lot of people who would have been nominated for the same jobs that they had by Mitt Romney or John McCain or whoever. In the second administration, we're seeing a lot of Trump people. We're seeing a lot of very different approaches to that. I think that, you know, they're going to try to govern differently. They're going to try to accomplish more things. Um, some of that Democrats could potentially obstruct, but I'm not sure. Yeah, long term, I'm not sure how much of that makes sense and how versus how much put Pete Hegseth in charge of the Department of Defense. People are going to hate it. They're going to hate it, and then they're going to see, oh, maybe we shouldn't have people like this in charge.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. At the same time, I think of like January 6th, right? Like that's the sort of thing where Trump was just free to do what he wanted. He did something. It was it was just clearly awful, and Americans saw it as awful. And then
Yeah,
a few years later, it was not at all disqualifying.
and they saw it
Yeah,
in part because we're such a tribal and partisan culture that Mitch McConnell thought it was awful and then decided that it wasn't worth his trouble to do anything about it.
right.
And Republican leaders, the reason that that had the potential to break through is because at first a lot of Republicans said this is unacceptable, and then Republicans decided it was acceptable, and they backed away from that, and so they gave permission for all that to happen. And then you get into all the challenges of the media and our environment. Yeah, I mean that there was a real moment to do something with that we didn't take advantage of, and um again, but Trump tried to overthrow the government, but he didn't, right? That it's one more example of it's a thing that he said he was going to do that didn't happen, that the system stopped him from doing. Um, and again, it keeps lowering the cost of voting for these people.
Yeah, I mean, my concern, I mean, let's say, there's already been talk of like, changing the Biden policy that lowered insulin costs. And so let's say that Trump endorses that and suddenly insulin costs a lot more money. Well, that's going to, obviously, that really impacts a lot of people. It hurts a lot of people. But Republicans will immediately defend Donald Trump. They'll say, no, this was actually Joe Biden's fault. And most will believe that. Democrats will oppose him but they already opposed him. So maybe it changes some minds, but probably not a whole lot. So yeah, maybe, it's good for people to actually see the costs with these things as opposed to just the symbolism and the threats. But I'm not sure that's going to change that many minds.
Yeah, I mean, I think where one of the things that's been clear about voters for a long time is that a lot of people vote against their interests, right? That you've got a lot of people who are pro-choice,
Well,
but they
their
vote for
economic
anti-choice
interests.
candidates.
Yeah.
But also they're social interests,
Yeah.
right? You've got a lot of pro-choice voters that vote for anti-choice candidates because they don't think it's going to make a difference, right? They don't think that it matters. You have a lot of people who are in favor of marriage equality who are voting for candidates who would repeal it if they could because they don't think it matters. And I do think that we and this is a long-term structure. And again, I don't want anyone to say like, oh, John Hagner says that we should encourage mass deportations because that will help the Democratic Party in 20 years. Like, I'm not like, there are a lot of real people who are going to suffer by the decisions this administration makes. But I do think in the big picture, one of the reasons that we are in the situation that we are in is because we keep making the cost less and less for putting these folks in charge, right? That, Republican majorities are the reason that school shooters can get MI15s, right? Like that is what has happened, but we have separated that out, and from people think that they're voting for this Republican candidate because he doesn't like the people they don't like, and what ends up happening is that we have weapons of war in our streets. That
Right.
we have
Right.
separated the cost and the action in a way that again no other democracy has. And I think that this is really where, as I've been learning more about comparative systems and reading the political science literature, what makes our system so much different is that in the UK, a party gets elected with a plan, they get to implement their plan. That they have a majority in parliament, they can pass almost all the bills that they want to pass, that they go out and govern. They tell the voters what they want to do, they get into power, they're able to do it. We tell voters what we want to do, we get into power, we're not able to do it. Republicans say what they want to do, they get into power, they're not able to do it. We end up with these systems that are about nothing. So they become about noise, and they become about drama, and they become about emotion, and they become about, you know, the performance of politics rather than the work of politics. And I think it's a huge challenge that our entire system faces. And I think Trump is going to test it in the second term. Trump is going to test it more than it ever has, right? Because I believe from everything that I have read that he truly does intend to put 25% tariffs on our friends and neighbors, that he truly does intend to deport 30 million people, that he's going to work really hard to make that happen, and that he has learned a lot more about how to make the government work. And I think that this sort of era of nothing happens in politics is going to change, and it opens up a lot of real questions about what Democrats should do. Which of these things that we should put all our resources into stopping the best that we can, and which we're not going to be able to stop. So we at least need to make them own it. Yeah, I realize I'm a little bit all over the place today, and I apologize for not being having a more coherent argument here. But I think it's worth thinking about. There's a fever in American life right now that we've got people voting for candidates who are advocating for things that they don't actually support, supported by media environments that sort of like sane wash what they're doing.
Hmm.
And I think that we both need an immediate strategy to minimize human pain, to maximize democratic opportunities in the next couple elections. But we also need to be thinking, more big picture and more long term about how do we keep this country together? How do we get people talking to each other again? How do we make it so that we dislike each other and are terrified of each other? Get back to the way that politics sort of is designed to work. And yeah, I got a lot more questions than answers right now.
Whew. Okay. That's a lot, and honestly, I
It
don't
was a
know.
lot.
We're gonna get some good evidence on this coming very soon from the new government. But at this point, heck, why don't we turn to a discussion of pastries? Um, I don't know if you have a particular thing you want to talk about here. I actually have two questions for you. One, I was hoping you could tell us about the bread you're making right now while we're recording.
Yes, I am making sort of my standard country loaf right now. I'm having our neighbors over for fondue this evening. I went to high school in Switzerland, and I get this special cheese from the village that I grew up in, mail ordered, and I make really good fondue. So any of you who are in Minneapolis in the wintertime, coming over for fondue. So I'm doing my standard country loaf. I've been cultivating my starter now for 6 years, 7 years. My starter is named First Lady Rosalind Starter. So shout out to the Carter family of Georgia. God bless Jimmy Carter during this period of national mourning. So I'm letting
R.I.P.
letting the starter named after his wife do her job. But yeah, I do. I mill a lot of flour in my own house. I have a little portable mill, so I get local wheat and rye that I mill into flour mixed with King Arthur bread flour, and I do it usually once a week. Make bread, and I do a lot of sort of country love style. So this will be delicious dipped in today's fondue.
Wow. Okay. You're milling your own flour. That is fairly badass, I have to
I
admit.
am milling my own flour. This is what I started during the pandemic when flour was sort of hard to source.
Yes.
But I also, got really into the idea of like my favorite thing about bread is how local it can be. That the flour that I'm milling comes from my community, right? It comes from a few miles away. But my what I love about sourdough starters is that they taste like the places that they have been cultivated. In obviously a diffuse way that but San Francisco sourdough bread tastes different than non-San Francisco bread because the biome in San Francisco is different. It's more sour, it's more tangy. And the starter that I have, I cultivated when I lived in DC, but I brought with me to Ohio, I brought with me to Paris, I brought with me to Minnesota. And it has a little bit of all of those places that I have lived, and I love that I can carry that with me.
Yes, I agree. But I have actually a question about yeast on this, because there are some breads and some other baking projects where we can't always rely on sourdough starter. I will sometimes use a Fleischmann yeast, and I'm actually curious. Fleischmann famously has two yeast products. They're Active Dry and they're Rapid Rise. And I have this sneaking suspicion that there is zero difference between those two. And I wanted to ask you if you happen to know what the distinction is between those two.
My understanding, and I'm not looking this up, so I'm going purely off what I know, is they're very similar, but that the um, active you are supposed to hydrate for 5 or 10 minutes before you mix into the dough. So, a lot of recipes will give you instructions to take the yeast, a little bit of warm water, sometimes a little bit of sugar, and let it sit for 5 minutes to get the bubbling started, and then mix it in. Whereas the instant you can just put directly
Oh,
into your dough, and it has something to do with the coating that's on the yeast. That the instant sort of has a process that strips away some of the protection that the active has.
okay.
I believe that that's the difference. That it's just if you can substitute the one for the other, but if you're using active, make sure that the first step of the recipe is let it hydrate with a little bit of the water that you're going to use in the recipe.
Excellent.
I use the Red Star Active is my go-to because it comes in the like 2-pound bags that live
Ah,
in my refrigerator,
okay.
and I love a bulk product.
Excellent. Okay. I think that pretty much wraps it up for us for this first episode of 2025. The next time we will record, there will be a different president, and we'll already have a lot to talk about from that.
We
So
sure will.
thank you all for listening. John, thank you for a great conversation today. And
Thank you for listening to my rant.
yes,
Yeah, I
excellent.
appreciate that. I've had that to get off my chest for a while.
And thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you all soon. Take care and
All
stay
right.
safe.
Take care.
Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Masket. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.